For many of us, there are a few times in our life where our favorite will last. Favorite films, favorite music, favorite books all grow and change as we grow older. Perhaps this is a form of wisdom, of new experiences, but most of the time it's just discovering something better. As technology ages, especially in the case of video games, so does our opinion on what a good game is. Those that grew up with video games, playing consoles like the NES, PlayStation 1, or Sega Genesis will remember classics that likely still hold up all these years down the road. Telling most people your favorite game is Sonic the Hedgehog 2 or Super Mario Bros. Wouldn't lead to any confusion or disagreement in terms of quality of game. A lot of retro games like Mega Man, Pac-Man, or even Tetris have paved the way for the future of video games. And if you came into gaming later in life or in the younger demographics, video games on the 360, PS3, or PC might not be guaranteed to have the same hold-up value that retro games do. Although there are modern franchises that are considered just as important, most of them date back to at least 2013, which is over 10 years ago. The Halo franchise, the original God of War trilogy, and StarCraft, all notable and respected franchises on their platforms, have become, well, old. As time goes on, it's become tougher for modern games to contribute lasting changes to the gaming industry, even though we are still far from perfection in games. The core mechanics and genres have been decided, and a genre-bending game only comes around once in a blue moon. Being new and inventive, going off the beaten path, all while providing a playable game is something we don't see often. Most developers are lacking one thing: financial support. Even if a game flops, proven independent studio Supergiant Games didn't take on as much risk as a smaller and less known studio would have with the release of Hades. Perhaps the most recent modern game to change a genre, 2018 saw the release of Hades and consequently the modern roguelike. It is for all these reasons that choosing to do a retrospective series is one thing I don't take lightly. I have spent hours listening to and disagreeing with essay YouTubers. Their pessimistic look on the history of gaming creates a "it could always be better" narrative in the gaming industry. Looking back at the state of games when something like Bioshock 1 was released, the technology wasn't there to make the game better. Some of my favorite games are not on some of the first generation of consoles, releasing as recently as 2016. Defending these games when we have both rose-colored glasses and a pessimistic outlook on gaming in general feels like a hard task to take on by oneself. These games fall into either one of two categories. They are either some of the funnest games I have ever played, or I consider them to be pinnacles of innovation in the gaming community at their time of release. On very rare occasion, could fall into both categories. And although remembering the bad games are just as important as reminiscing on good games in the gaming industry, I think we spend a little too much time lambasting past decisions of game developers instead of praising what was done right. A large part of our discussion should be on what we can repeat to make a better industry. So I thought I'd put myself on easy mode to start. Today we're taking a look back at the Bioshock franchise. Although this video started out as a defense of Bioshock 1, I have realized during my research just how integral all three games were to the gaming industry. Even though we are trying to remain spoiler-free, I will interject that there are mild spoilers for Bioshock 1, 2, and Infinite within this video. There's nothing that will ruin the experience or spoil major parts of the game, but we do allude to a few key plot points within the franchise. I appreciate the support from any viewer, but if you haven't yet played the Bioshock franchise and intend to, I would encourage you to put this video on pause and return afterwards. These games are the epitome of art in gaming, and to have the experience tainted by anyone, but especially me, would be heartbreaking. From the first video game, thought to be created in 1958 up to 2007, there was one thing video games were still lacking: the respect of being considered art, or at least a significant part of the culture. A growing industry, Sony was still celebrating the success of the PlayStation 2, which to date is still the best-selling console of all time at 149 million units. After the release of Bioshock in 2007, Irrational Games accomplished something that no other video game had been able to achieve. It had the mainstream media asking the question, are video games a work of art? If you grew up playing video games, it's not a hard stretch to see that these games are art. The combination of music, storytelling, and physical art, whether pixel, 2D, or 3D, create a masterful environment for the imagination to run wild. Going back to the N64, We were lucky enough to have games like Banjo-Kazooie, which has one of the most iconic video game soundtracks from the N64. Games are filled with bright, stylistic choices and have artists collaborating from all disciplines. In 2007, felt like we took a dramatic step away from what once was. Although the narrative of video games are dangerous would continue on into the present day, several journalists took a look at Bioshock and thought something else. It's a weird thing to look back on and see, as Bioshock is first and foremost an atmospheric horror. The game is gruesome, dark, and strives to keep the player on edge for the entirety of the playthrough. Horror has never been a mainstream media, but journalists took this dark tale, told under the sea, and started asking whether video games were works of art. And eventually, whether they were worth preserving in museums. If you have experienced the world of Rapture, whether it's watching someone play through it on Twitch and YouTube, dive deep into the undersea city, or picking up the controller yourself, you'll recognize that it isn't the game mechanics or the graphics that make this game so special. Although the game itself plays extremely well, it is the atmosphere of a falling 1960s world, frozen in time under the sea. What remains with us from Rapture is not a lasting impression of the greatest graphics ever made, but an impactful story and incredible ride through the direction of Ken Levine. One of my favorite reviews of Bioshock back in 2007 is from the LA Times, which includes this quote: "Sure, it's fun to play, looks spectacular, and is easy to control, but it also does something no other game has done to date. It really makes you feel." End quote. If you were writing about video games in the 2000s, the 90s, or the 80s, I imagine it was hard to get emotionally invested in what you were seeing on screen. Games that were popularized in the Western Hemisphere, like Fable, Banjo-Kazooie, and Halo, lacked a story that dragged players in. This isn't to say that these games didn't tell a good story, but it was more of a story that gamers would be adapted to. You are the hero. You are here to save someone or something in specific. And when that was all over, the game was done. We hadn't yet realized that the new technological medium for delivering content to players is perhaps one of the most powerful when it comes to storytelling. Fans of the JRPG will recognize, of course, that Final Fantasy franchise was around for much longer. While this game holds the hearts of many, it isn't unfair to say that JRPGs were a more niche import from Japan at the time. The franchise is now one of the most subscribed to MMORPGs, but at the time had two things going against it: anime themes and video games, both of which were not popular in the Western world during the 90s. In most video games during the 90s and 2000s, we lacked a vision of telling a story that modern games do so well, questioning whether you are the hero, having a higher moral storyline to follow, and making decisions that impact the story you are being told. Bioshock's overarching story, from 1 to an Infinite, is almost solely based around the idea of agency in a person. How much of our life do we get to decide? It wouldn't be until 2007, when Bioshock, Mass Effect, and Assassin's Creed released, that we would be catapulted into a new age of storytelling in gaming that still remains to this day. Tackling larger and larger issues every day, we now have the likes of Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us, the Telltale series, Spiritfarer, and the new God of War reboot, bringing us further and further into the golden age of storytelling for games. These games rely less and less on you being the golden boy, the hero, the random guy from the small town to save the world, and more on the questioning of why is the world even worth saving. We might be set on epic adventures, but it isn't without us learning a few things about the hero, and usually they aren't good things. The impact that Bioshock had on the industry in 2007 allowed us to pursue deeper and newer storylines. It was an opportunity for game developers to try their hand at not just putting a story to a game, but telling us a story through a video game. And although 2007 was a big year for gaming, we can't overlook 2013 and the release of Bioshock Infinite. The difference between 2007 and 2013 in terms of gaming is, I think, this. We didn't gain one undeniably new trait for modern games in 2013. But if 2007 was the start of the golden age of storytelling, 2013 was the year games proved to us that innovation and new standards are still being set. 2013 was a spectacular year for gaming. We saw the release of Bioshock Infinite, The Last of Us, and Grand Theft Auto V. Each of these games would set a new standard in gaming for the next 10 years in their own unique ways. To talk about Bioshock Infinite and more modern gaming, we have to take a quick detour to cover some basic ground. There was a phrase being thrown around in 2023, the Xbox tax. It is the idea that if a game is published for the Xbox and primarily touted as an exclusive, even if just a timed exclusive, the game will be treated harsher by games critics and shown less attention. The idea comes from a few things, but primarily leading the cry is the idea that games media covers PlayStation exclusives more than other games because they tend to sell significantly more consoles. There are a lot of issues with this argument, ranging from the idea that Microsoft is clearly abandoning first-party titles in favor of things like Game Pass, all the way to Nintendo being strategic with the releases of new first-party titles. Throughout my research for this episode, I have been looking at more release years in gaming and trying to highlight for myself what was impactful about the titles that came out in those years. You can pinpoint a few years in particular in which gaming will stand out in front of others. We've already talked about 2007 and 2013, but there's also 2001, with Halo Combat Evolved, Pikmin, Luigi's Mansion, Advance Wars, Devil May Cry, Animal Crossing, Smash Bros. Melee. There's 2004, Halo 2, Half-Life 2, The Original Fable, Metal Gear Solid 3, and World of Warcraft. There's 2022, which is arguably one of the most important years for indies, showing off games like Tunic, Stray, Sifu, Cult of the Lamb. It propelled Souls-like games into the limelight with the release of Elden Ring. I think one could make the argument that the beauty of 2022 was carried into 2023, when we had games like Spider-Man 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Tears of the Kingdom, Fire Emblem Engage, Alan Wake 2, Pikmin 4. That just feels like the tip of the iceberg. Gaming in 2022 and 2023 has been incredible, and it seems like it's only on the up and up. Although we can complain about broken games till the cows come home, the good thing about modern day gaming is developers have the opportunity to fix breaks in games instead of us living with them. And after reading up on several gaming release years, who won awards, who didn't, I don't believe the Xbox tax exists, but I do believe there is room for an argument regarding a PlayStation bonus. Bioshock Infinite was overshadowed largely by The Last of Us, which I'm sure deserves the acclaim it has. I haven't personally played or watched the TV show, and I'm not even entirely sure what happens within it, as I've always desired to play the games myself, I just never made the time. The Last of Us swept across the board from Bioshock Infinite. And perhaps the story is better, perhaps the gameplay is better. There is one thing that Bioshock Infinite did that no other game has come close to doing better. That is the companion NPC. After watching a retrospective video featuring Ken Levine on the YouTube channel DX, which I highly recommend for anyone to watch, I came to learn that the development team on Bioshock Infinite were told to cut Elizabeth from the game on multiple accounts. And so they created the Liz team, who would work solely on making sure Elizabeth worked in Bioshock Infinite. She was not to be an escort quest or someone you had to protect, but instead was an NPC that protected you and benefited you throughout the game. Sure, the internet spawned the meme of book or catch, but Elizabeth is one of the most useful NPC companions. Or at least one of the few that doesn't hinder your gameplay and adds a significant amount to the story. What's most surprising to me is if you start reading about retrospectives on Bioshock Infinite, as it's now been over 10 years, people consider it wasted potential and an unpolished game. The frustration surrounding Bioshock Infinite started with the release trailer shown for E3. The game that Ken Levine and the team at Irrational Games created was wildly different by the day it was released. The setting, characters, and concepts were similar, but gone were crazy powers that Elizabeth showed off. Gone was this menacing machine grabbing her from the shadows. Instead, we were delivered a game, still set in Colombia, with Elizabeth as a young and curious guide through town, and in the DLC, eventually, a heart-wrenching story of how Rapture had fallen. It is odd to dig through retrospectives not just of the Bioshock franchise, but of other games, and realize how harsh we have become on the past. Without entries like Bioshock 1, 2, or Infinite, we would be left with dry storytelling, or at least have been significantly delayed in discovering such rich storytelling within gaming. There is a reason to believe that we may have never gotten video game creation the recognition it deserves of being an art form without the Bioshock franchise. There is little doubt in my mind that the majority of these scathing retrospectives are reserved for Bioshock 2. The game has a significantly different feel to it than 1 and Infinite. And this has to do with both Bioshock 2 and Infinite being in development at the same time. Although released in completely different years, Ken Levine's directing voice was taken away from Bioshock 2, and instead he focused on Infinite. There was no interest in returning to Rapture from Ken Levine, but Bioshock 2 holds a significant piece of understanding towards the world of Rapture and the workings of the Big Daddy. Giving players the opportunity to take on the role of a Big Daddy, Bioshock 2 is an exciting adventure into the world of Rapture. With the introduction of dual wielding, you become a force to reckon with, while still balancing out the difficulty by making the game more of a protection quest than an offensive mission. And surprisingly, Bioshock 2 had critical acclaim on the story, even in comparison to Bioshock 1 and Bioshock Infinite. Digging through the awards section on IMDb, although 1 and Infinite were nominated and won more awards than 2, the nominations for Bioshock 2 was on the story. Even in 2010, stacked up against the likes of Heavy Rain, StarCraft II Wings of Liberty, Red Dead Redemption, Mass Effect 2, Alan Wake, and many others, Bioshock 2 was recognized as a pinnacle of storytelling. And it's considered the worst entry in the series by most fans. But if 1 was what changed storytelling forever, and Infinite is what gave us a look at the great companion NPC, then what was Bioshock 2? I believe that Bioshock 2 was the breadwinner. A successful game, both critically and for pulling in new fans, Bioshock 2 grew the fanbase and surged sales of the original Bioshock years after it had come out. The 3 million copies that Bioshock would ultimately sell would be deemed a failure to 2K. But that doesn't stop them from publishing Bioshock Infinite, which ended up selling 11 million copies. What could have been a nail in the coffin was also sort of a connecting bridge between Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite. Think of all the people that would have never bought Bioshock 1 without Bioshock 2. When I sat down to write this, I had many notes scribbled at the bottom of my documents. How to tie things together, how to make this fit into the retrospective category. And what I am continuing to realize is that everyone's experience with gaming is different. What I primarily think about in gaming is the history, the impact, and lifespan of video game titles. How one release back in 2007 propelled us forward. While editing, I realized this retrospective does not speak about the gameplay, the graphics, or really anything that most retrospectives cover. But I also realized that this tied into the original thesis of the retrospective, that Bioshock will not be remembered for any of those things. Bioshock will be remembered for changing an industry.